There are no legends in space, only facts and leftovers.
An old Earth scout? Are they serious? You can only tell stories with scrap metal like that. It's him, Rhys Valen. He's been dead for 10 years.
We opened a door we shouldn't have opened.
Sometimes the darkness returns, not to remind us, but to consume everything. The Thalasis Nebula was a place of whispered warnings and uncharted voids, a cosmic graveyard where even the boldest ships vanished without a trace. Its swirling clouds of ionized gases shimmered with strange hues, painting the blackness of space with an eerie, spectral glow. Alien civilizations had long abandoned attempts to map it, and the nebula became a scar on star charts, unchallenged and avoided. Yet now something stirred within its depths. The Unified Galactic Observer Council, a coalition of the galaxy's most advanced species, had detected the anomaly 2 hours prior. At first, it had seemed laughably insignificant, a derelict ship, barely intact, limping out of the nebula on flickering thrusters. When the long-range scans came through, the initial reaction from the observation station's crew was amusement. An antique human ship? Commander Kalesh, a towering Ithralin with iridescent scales, leaned forward to examine the projection. His wide, insectoid eyes blinked slowly in disbelief. It's a relic from centuries ago. The bridge filled with the low hum of disinterest. The ship was a mess, its hull a patchwork of old-world alloys and corroded plating. Ion scoring marred its surface, and fractures lined the fuselage as though it had survived countless impacts. The designation stenciled on the side was barely legible. ICF Spectral Eye. To the seasoned alien tacticians who manned the station, it was a joke at best, a bizarre artifact adrift in space. "It's a ghost ship," murmured one of the younger analysts, a Sarath whose jellyfish-like tendrils quivered with fascination. "Probably abandoned for centuries." "Or a human stunt," Kalesh replied, sneering. "They do have a flair for dramatics." As the ship drifted closer, scanners pulsed out readings, hollow echoes of the wreck's internal structure. Power signatures were faint but persistent. Then the long-range visual feed resolved into sharp clarity. The bridge fell silent. Through the cracked cockpit viewport, a figure sat in the pilot's seat. Kalesh rose slowly from his chair, the spines along his back lifting in unease. The figure's flight suit was unmistakably Terran, a relic of humanity's old wars. Its fabric was torn and faded, hanging loosely on an emaciated frame. The pilot's face was pale, his features gaunt as though drawn tight by some unseen force. And yet, "It's alive," whispered Kalesh's adjutant. "It's him." The chamber filled with soft gasps of recognition. Even among the cold, calculating alien strategists, the name was well known, a legend shrouded in fear. Commander Rhys Valen. Once he had been humanity's greatest pilot, a prodigy who had turned the tide of entire conflicts with his brilliance and daring. He was celebrated and feared in equal measure, a specter who could appear out of nowhere and dismantle fleets with surgical precision. But Rhys had vanished years ago, lost during the disastrous Omega Void campaign. Official records marked him as deceased. His body never recovered. Impossible, Kalesh hissed. He's been dead for a decade. The others stared, unblinking, as the figure's eyes opened, dark voids devoid of iris or sclera. No human spark remained in those empty sockets. The flickering lights of the cockpit cast sharp shadows across his skeletal face. Whatever had survived inside that ship, it was not entirely human. A low rumble vibrated through the observation station's deck plates as the spectralized thrusters flared to life. What should have been a failing, obsolete engine surged with unexpected force, propelling the ancient vessel forward. The ship's approach was slow at first, like the calculated prowl of a predator. "Scan it again," Kalesh barked, panic rising in his voice. "I want to know what the hell we're looking at." Data scrolled across the monitors, vitals, power readings, mass distributions, but none of it made sense. The ship's internal layout had changed. Biomatter signatures laced the readings like veins through flesh. No, that can't be right. The Seraph technician's gelatinous form quivered as he leaned closer to the console. The ship's structure is growing. There's organic material fused with the hull. Kalesh's mandibles clicked anxiously. Bioweapons? Did the humans develop some kind of... He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Reese's head tilted in the visual feed, his lifeless gaze fixed directly at the camera drone broadcasting from the station. The feeling that spread through the war room was primal and universal, an instinctive recognition of a predator's focus. The communications officer let out a strangled breath. He's looking at us." The alien commanders exchanged uneasy glances. This was no random derelict, and Reese Valen was no lost soul returned home. Something had claimed him, dragged him from the abyss, and rebuilt him into a grotesque mockery of what he once was. The spectral eye picked up speed, its hull groaning as though alive. Its approach vector changed, directly toward the observation station. "Defensive perimeter active," Kalesh roared, clawing at the console to issue the alert. "Intercepting squadron, now!" Two sleek alien corvettes surged forward from the docking bay, their engines blazing as they intercepted the ancient vessel. Plasma cannons locked on, charging with lethal energy. Over the comms, the pilots' voices remained professional, yet tense. "Target in range. Acquiring lock." The spectral eye didn't slow. The first corvette unleashed a burst of concentrated plasma, a direct hit. The explosion rippled across the spectral eye's hull, shearing off fragments of rusted plating. But instead of slowing, the ship surged forward, as though the damage had only made it hungrier. The second corvette fired as well, aiming for the engines. This time, the spectral eye shifted mid-flight. The thrusters twisted unnaturally, avoiding the plasma barrage by mere meters. It slammed into the corvette's side with a sickening crunch. The viewing screens showed jagged tendrils, pale and sinewy, unfurling from the spectral eye's undercarriage. They wrapped around the corvette like constricting vines, piercing the hull. Within seconds, the ship was dead in the void, its life support systems crushed and spilling oxygen into space like blood from a wound. Inside the observation station, a deadly quiet took hold. "No ship moves like that," one of the officers whispered. Kalesh's eyes never left the screen. "That's not a ship anymore." The spectral eye broke free of the wreckage and continued its relentless course toward the station. Rhys Valen's blank face remained visible in the feed, a grotesque figure chained to the controls of a living nightmare. The war room's lights flickered, and for the first time in decades, Kalish felt something cold and unfamiliar in his chest. Fear. The alarms blared through every corridor of the observation station, a deafening chorus of klaxons and flashing red lights. The cold hum of war protocols surged to life as the defensive grid adjusted its trajectory. Plasma turrets and missile pods pivoted toward the approaching ship, their targeting systems locking onto the incoming spectral eye. Yet, even as weapons charged to full capacity, dread had already seeped into the command crew like a toxin. From the war room's central display, the image of Rhys Valen remained fixed, his gaunt, lifeless face a hollowed-out ruin of the man once known as humanity's greatest tactician. His skin was ashen and pulled taut, his mouth unmoving. But his eyes, those black, unending voids, seemed to stare through the screen, through the walls, and into the minds of everyone watching. Kalesh's claws dug into the armrest of his command throne. His scales shifted colors in erratic pulses, an involuntary sign of fear among his species. "Report!" he barked, trying to drown out the rising sense of panic. The Seruth technician trembled at his station, fluidic tendrils fluttering nervously. "Admiral, the ship's power output, it's increasing beyond its original capacity." Kalish whipped his head toward the console. "That's impossible. Those engines are centuries old." The technician gestured wildly at the readouts. "It's like something else is fueling it. The ship's energy signature is mutating. It's no longer purely mechanical." Another officer interrupted, his voice shaking. "The biomatter readings. They've spread. The hull isn't just fused with organic components, it's growing. The spectral eye is alive." The war room fell silent save for the blaring alarms. The spectral eye had closed half the distance between itself and the station. Outside, the void rippled with the hum of approaching alien squadrons. The interceptors swarmed like hornets, weaving in a deadly formation around the ancient human ship. Their plasma cannons flared, filling space with streaks of blue-white energy. Explosions blossomed as volleys struck true, ripping through the outer plating of the derelict. But the spectral eye didn't break apart. Instead, the wounded sections of its hull rippled unnaturally, where steel and composite alloys had been sheared away. Fleshy tendrils sprouted and twisted together like sinews knitting themselves back into place. What should have been fatal damage was simply absorbed. The fleet's commander shouted through the comms, "We're not damaging it, it's regenerating." Inside the war room, Kalesh slammed his fist down. "Concentrate fire. Overwhelm it. Burn it to nothing." The fleet obeyed. Dozens of ships converged, surrounding the spectral eye in a web of coordinated firepower. Missile salvos erupted in synchronized waves. Blinding eruptions lit the void, scattering debris. The spectral eye was engulfed in a sphere of fire, obscured entirely by the brilliance of the bombardment. For a moment, there was silence. The flames burned brightly against the endless black, their embers dying into faint, glowing shards of metal. But then the fire dissipated, and the ship emerged, scarred but whole. The spectral eye's hull writhed with fresh, living tissue that pulsed like exposed muscle. Pale, translucent veins stretched across the metal, pumping some thick, viscous fluid that shimmered under the starlight. Then the ship retaliated. From the spectral eye's underside, grotesque appendages extended outward, long barbed tendrils that lashed through space. The first struck an interceptor dead on, piercing its fuselage and impaling the pilot before dragging the broken vessel into the spectral eye's mass. The hull absorbed the corvette like a predator devouring prey. A panicked scream echoed over the comms. "It's feeding on us!" The fleet descended into chaos. Ships scattered in every direction as the spectral eye lashed out with merciless precision. The war room's view screen flickered as feed after feed went dark, each one replaced by bursts of static and brief glimpses of destruction. Bodies drifted out of shattered cockpits, their limbs splayed and limp. Some of the wreckage still pulsed unnervingly as the spectral eye consumed it. Kalesh watched in mounting horror. How is it moving like this? One of his senior officers, an elderly Torvani tactician, turned to him, her beady eyes wide with grim realization. This isn't war. It's something else. A predator wearing the guise of a ship. And Rhys Valen. She swallowed hard, unable to finish the thought. The Serath technician's voice broke the tense silence. "Sir, there's a biosignature originating from the ship's core, I think." He hesitated. "It's him. It's Valen's body." Kalesh stepped forward, dread clawing at the edges of his mind. "Explain." The Serath's tendrils trembled. "The organic structure. It's using him. His brain, his nerves, his entire body has become part of the ship's nervous system. He's integrated. Not dead. Not alive. Something else." The realization spread through the war room like cold fire. Rhys Valen, the celebrated war hero, wasn't merely piloting the spectral eye. He was the ship now. Something had taken him, twisted him beyond recognition, and fused him with the ship in a grotesque symbiosis. Kalesh's breath rattled as the truth settled in. Whatever had found Valen in the void hadn't killed him. It had transformed him into something far worse. The spectral eye surged forward, closing the distance to the observation station. A pulsing hum resonated through the walls, a low, mournful sound that vibrated through their bones. The war room's lights flickered and dimmed as the ship's unnatural power corrupted their systems. The comms crackled with a final broadcast from one of the few remaining interceptors. The pilot's voice was raw with terror. "We can't stop it. It's not just a ship, it's alive. Gods, it's him." The transmission cut to static. Kalesh turned to his crew, his voice sharp and brittle. "We evacuate, now!" But even as the order left his mouth, a shudder ran through the station. The spectral eye had latched onto the exterior hull, its tendrils burrowing into the metal. The war room's monitors flickered as internal systems failed one by one. Through the main viewport, Rhys Valen's face loomed larger, his hollow eyes locked on the station's heart. The ship wasn't there to negotiate. It was there to consume. The first impact reverberated through the observation station like a seismic tremor. Bulkheads groaned under the strain as the spectral eye's tendrils drove deep into the metal, piercing decks and corridors with unsettling precision. A sickening, wet sound echoed through the station as organic matter spread like roots through the ship's veins, fusing with machinery and consuming entire sections of the hull. Admiral Kalesh stumbled forward, gripping the edge of the console to steady himself. Warning icons flared across every monitor, displaying reports of breaches across multiple levels. Oxygen leaks, power failures, and structural collapse painted the screen in a grim mosaic of red and black. The war room's air grew thin, carrying the metallic tang of emergency filtration systems. "Containment protocols. Seal off the lower decks," Kalesh shouted, though he knew it was futile. His command crew scrambled to obey, but panic had already taken root. Through the viewport, the spectral eye loomed like a predator with its teeth sunk deep into prey. The once ancient vessel now pulsed and writhed with bioorganic growth, its surface glistening as veins of translucent ichor pumped some nightmarish substance through its core. The ship's skeletal frame had become a living, breathing thing. In the docking bay, entire squadrons were wiped out before they could launch. The station's last remaining defense frigates were shredded by the bio-ship's barbed tendrils. Shattered hulls drifted aimlessly, leaking plasma and frozen corpses into the void. The spectral eye's hunger was endless, consuming metal and flesh alike in its relentless advance. Kalesh's adjutant, a young officer with pale, trembling scales, stumbled toward him. "The infestation, it's spreading too fast." His voice cracked. "We can't stop it." Kalesh turned to the main tactical display where the biomatter's progression was rendered in grim detail. Entire wings of the station had gone dark, sections overtaken by writhing tendrils and alien growths that consumed walls, ceilings, and anything organic they touched. Surveillance footage flickered across the screens in jarring fragments. A technician screaming as the floor beneath him ruptured into a mass of fibrous tendrils that dragged him down. A squad of soldiers firing wildly before their weapons jammed, their barrels clogged with mucus-like strands. A cold, hollow dread settled over Kalesh. "It's not just consuming the station," he whispered. "It's evolving." The Seroth technician turned, his gelatinous tendrils quivering violently. "Admiral, we're detecting new growths forming. Spines, armored plating, even limbs. It's absorbing our technology and adapting it. If it breaches the core..." A thunderous crack interrupted him as the station's midsection ruptured. The viewport's reinforced glass splintered, showing the jagged wound carved into the station's hull. From it, the spectral eye's tendrils expanded, spreading web-like across the superstructure. Kalesh's eyes widened as he realized what the bioship was doing. It's using the station itself to grow, to rebuild itself. Beyond the viewport, the spectral eye had begun to change. The organic mass spread outward, sheathing the ship in new armor-like plating formed from the station's absorbed framework. The vessel's once obsolete shape had taken on a monstrous new silhouette, its form a grotesque hybrid of human engineering and alien evolution. The once fractured wings of the ship now bristled with spines that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. The war room's emergency doors slammed shut as security systems attempted to hold back the creeping infestation. but the ship was already inside, its tendrils snaking through ventilation shafts and power conduits. Entire corridors pulsed with fleshy, twitching growth. Lights dimmed and surged as the station's energy was siphoned away. Kalesh's adjutant stumbled back as the floor at his feet began to swell. The metal split open, revealing a churning mass of translucent tissue. The adjutant let out a strangled scream as barbed tendrils shot upward, piercing through his chest and yanking him into the writhing maw. His body spasmed once before vanishing into the alien biomass. Kalesh staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He turned to his remaining officers, their faces pale with terror. "We have to reach the emergency core, initiate a full overload. It's the only way." The Torvani strategist stepped forward, her voice grim. "If we overload the core, we'll destroy the entire station." Kalesh met her gaze, his mandibles clicking with finality. "If we don't, this thing will devour everything. We're already dead if we stay here." A rumbling tremor shook the war room as another section of the station buckled. From the far wall, a fissure split open, revealing a mass of bone-like tendrils that slithered into the room. The bioship was closing in. Kalesh slammed the emergency override. "Evacuate whoever's left. Get them to the lifeboats." He turned to the remaining officers. "We move to the core. Now!" The surviving crew sprinted down the flickering corridors, the walls alive with twitching growths. The air was thick with a stench of decay and ozone, like the breath of some massive beast. Behind them, the sounds of tearing metal and wet, slithering movements grew louder. As they reached the main reactor chamber, Kalesh paused, turning to glance down the length of the corridor. Through the dim light, a figure emerged. It was Rhys Valen, or what was left of him. His once proud form had been twisted into something monstrous. His torso was elongated, his ribs split and fused with the biomechanical plating of the ship. His arms had become grotesque, barbed appendages that twitched with lethal intent. His face was barely recognizable, stretched and broken, with exposed bone forming jagged ridges beneath his skin. Kalesh felt a chill unlike anything he had ever known. Valen's mouth opened and a guttural, wet sound emerged. Not a scream, but something far worse. A sound of hunger and pain, as though he were aware of his own damnation, but powerless to stop it. "Run!" Kalesh roared, shoving his crew toward the reactor controls. Behind them, Valen lunged, his limbs moving with inhuman speed. The first officer to fall was split in two, his blood painting the walls. Kalesh fired his plasma pistol, the shots striking Valen's mutated frame, but they barely slowed him. The Torvani strategist reached the core's console, her hands trembling as she activated the reactor's overload sequence. The lights dimmed as the core's countdown began. Valen let out a deafening, inhuman roar and surged forward. Kalesh charged to meet him, plasma blade drawn. He knew he wouldn't survive, but he also knew there was no retreat. With a final battle cry, he plunged the blade into Valen's chest, even as the mutated pilot's talons tore through his torso. The war room's last remaining screen displayed the final countdown, 0010. As Kalesh's vision blurred, he saw Valen's face up close, those hollow, endless eyes filled with agony. 0005. "May the void take you," Kalesh whispered as darkness overtook him. The station's reactor detonated in a brilliant, blinding flash that engulfed the spectral eye in fire. The shockwave rippled through space, shattering the remnants of the station into molten debris. For a brief moment, the void was silent again, but far beyond the wreckage, something stirred in the darkness. Pieces of biomatter drifted, writhing and reforming, drawn together by some relentless instinct. The hunger had not been quenched, only delayed. The reactor's explosion was like a dying sun, a burst of light and fury that ripped the station apart in a searing wave of fire and molten shrapnel. The remnants of the observation station spiraled into the void, fragments of metal and bone-like growth drifting weightlessly, illuminated by the fading afterglow. For a moment there was silence, but the quiet did not bring peace. In the debris field where the spectral eye should have been annihilated, there was movement. Shards of bioorganic tissue pulsed faintly, their severed tendrils twitching as though alive. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to draw together, fusing into larger masses, knitting themselves back into a grotesque whole. Far from the wreckage, the surviving ships of the Council's fleet hung in stunned silence, their crews watching in disbelief as the pieces of the abomination coalesced. They had thrown everything they had at the spectral eye, the best weapons of a dozen species, the desperate sacrifice of their strongest station, and still it endured. In the command deck of the Virexian Lance, the largest remaining Council vessel, Commander Trenvas stared at the flickering tactical display. His elongated limbs were taut with tension, his gills flaring as his twin hearts raced. The projection updated in grim detail. The biosignatures were strengthening, reforming, rebuilding. "No," Trenvas whispered. His voice was soft, hollow with disbelief. "It can't still be alive." A young officer's voice broke the fragile silence. "Sir, the fleet is awaiting your command. What do we do?" Trenvas' hands tightened into trembling fists. He could feel the weight of every life hanging on his next words. The last bastion of the galaxy's might had fallen. They had nothing left, no fortified station, no superweapons, no reinforcements waiting on the edge of the void. All that remained were a few battered ships and the raw, desperate will to survive. For a fleeting moment, Trenvas considered ordering a retreat. But retreat to where? No corner of the galaxy would be safe if the spectral eye was allowed to live. They had witnessed its hunger firsthand. It would not stop. Trenvas turned to face his bridge crew. Their eyes were filled with fear, but they were also waiting, hoping for something that would make the terror bearable. He spoke with quiet conviction. "We make our stand here." A murmur rippled through the bridge. Trenvas stepped forward, his voice rising. "If we run, we doom every living world to this horror. We cannot outrun it. We cannot hide. We fight now because there is no one else left to fight." The officers nodded, their expressions hardening. Trenvas felt the flicker of something stronger than fear, courage, born of desperation and fury. "Patch me through to the fleet." A second later, his voice carried across every remaining ship. "Listen to me. Our time is over if we let this thing escape. We've seen what it is, what it can do. but I refuse to be remembered as the one who watched it spread across our worlds. If this is where we fall, then we will make our final hour something that will haunt the stars for eternity." A chorus of acknowledgments followed. The fleet's fractured formation began to shift, tightening into a defensive wedge around the largest vessels. Weapons hummed to life, shields flared, and thrusters burned bright against the darkness. Outside, the monstrosity that had once been the spectral eye was reawakening. Tendrils of reconstructed flesh slithered through the void, forming grotesque limbs of serrated bone. New armored plates grew along its surface, jagged and unnaturally symmetrical, like wings of an infernal beast. Its core pulsed with a dim, hateful light. In its cockpit, if it could still be called that, the twisted remains of Rhys Valen stood motionless. His face, though grotesquely elongated and fused with the ship's systems, still bore the faintest remnants of its human origins. The hollow gaze of his black eyes betrayed nothing but an endless, mindless hunger. The man he had been, the hero who had inspired terror and awe, was gone. Yet somewhere, deep within that corrupted mass of sinew and bone, there was a flicker, a memory, an echo of the pilot he had once been. The fleet opened fire. Streams of plasma and missile barrages carved through the void, their light filling the endless black. The first impacts struck true, detonating against the bioship's exterior and tearing through its growing appendages. The spectral eye twisted, shrieking in frequencies that made the hulls of the council ships tremble. The Virexian lance led the charge, its plasma lances burning holes through the ship's outer layers. But with each wound inflicted, the bioship adapted. New layers of hardened tissue formed almost instantaneously. Tendrils lashed out like spears, impaling smaller vessels and dragging them into its writhing mass. The fleet's lines began to break, consumed by the sheer ferocity of the abomination's onslaught. Trenvus watched as ship after ship vanished from the display. His heart clenched with every red dot that flickered out. Yet still, they fought. The Virexian lance shuddered as a tendril slammed into its hull, breaching the lower decks. Trenvus grabbed the edge of his console as sparks rained down. The voices of his crew screamed through the comms, cut short as another tendril tore into the reactor bay. Trenvus staggered toward the weapons console, his breath ragged. His fingers hovered over the final override, a direct detonation. He knew what it meant. The ship, his crew, would be annihilated. But if it could buy the galaxy even a few more moments. He pressed the command. A klaxon blared as the Virexian lance's reactor surged toward critical mass. Trenvus exhaled slowly, his fear replaced by grim resolve. The ship's forward thrusters engaged, sending it on a collision course with the spectral eye. The bioship twisted, its tendrils flailing in desperate recognition. But it was too late. The Virexian lance struck its core. The reactor detonated in a burst of brilliant white. The void became blinding as energy tore through the bioship, ripping its grotesque form apart. Sinew and bone disintegrated, scattering into the abyss. For a moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. When the light faded, all that remained was debris, glowing fragments of charred biomatter and molten steel drifting silently. In the wreckage's stillness, the surviving ships drifted aimlessly, Communications crackled with static, interspersed with quiet sobs and muted voices calling for survivors. On the bridge of a damaged frigate, a Saruth officer leaned against his console, bleeding and exhausted. He whispered the thought shared by every surviving soul. Did we win? But as the debris field drifted, something small, a piece of living tissue, floated past the viewport. A faint pulse ran through its translucent form, like a heartbeat. The officer stared, horror sinking into his bones. He tried to raise the alarm, but his voice failed. The last bastion had fallen, and in the endless expanse of space, the hunger would rise again.